Today on Literacy for Legend and Friends, A Surprise for Mrs. Tortoise by Paula Merlán and Sonja Wimmer. A surprise for Mrs. Tortoise. The sun still hadn't risen, but Mrs. Tortoise was already awake. She popped her head out of her shell and had a look around. Though everything was as it should be, she felt like something extraordinary was about to happen to her. Birdie, her very best friend, was still daydreaming in the mist, in his nest. Just like every morning, Mrs. Tortoise took very slow steps to a nearby pond to freshen up. But that morning, something startled her when she saw her own reflection in the water. Her face was wrinkled and her shell looked worn out. It was right then that she felt old and very, very sad. As the sun came up, Birdie came fluttering around. "Good morning, my friend. What's wrong?" I feel really sad," replied Mrs. Tortoise. "Time goes by so fast. Look at me. I'm old and wrinkled. And don't even get me started on my shell. It's a disaster." Birdie took a good long look at her shell. "You're right. It does need fixing up a little. But that's easy enough," he said confidently. "I've got it. We'll ask the sky to lend you a handful of stars. Your shell will twinkle beautifully." Mrs. Tortoise thought it sounded like a good idea, so the sky sent her some very pretty stars. Her shell sparkled brightly, but when night came and it got dark, the light from the shiny stars wouldn't let her sleep. The next morning, Birdie flew over to see how his friend was doing. Mrs. Tortoise was very tired. "My shell was so bright that I didn't get any sleep at all," she cried. Check out that UFO. Birdie came up with another idea straight away. "I've got it. We'll ask the plants to give us a bunch of flowers. That way you can cover your shell with beautiful colors." Mrs. Tortoise thought it would be a good idea, so the plants sent a sack full of flowers. Her friend Birdie. Mrs. Tortoise's shell was splashed all over with colors, but soon the petals got old and dry, and their sweet smell faded away. "It's no use," said Mrs. Tortoise, disheartened. See, she's all sad, and her flowers are wilting. Even Mr. Birdie looks upset. "Don't be upset, my friend," Birdie cried out. "We will ask the wind to sweep in some clouds. That way you will look just like a soft cotton ball." Mrs. Tortoise thought it might be a good idea, so the wind came and gave Mrs. Tortoise a couple of clouds that completely enveloped her shell. But soon, the clouds made her feel wet and uncomfortable. "It's still no use," Mrs. Tortoise cried desperately. Birdie couldn't think of any other way to help her. "Maybe, just maybe, if we ask—" "I've had enough!" Mrs. Tortoise shouted. "All you've managed to do is make me feel worse." Ooh, Mrs. Tortoise is upset. She blew Birdie's hat right off. Angry, Mrs. Tortoise disappeared into the woods. As she walked along, she started to cry. She knew Birdie was only trying to help her, and she had been really mean to him. She stopped to rest a while and fell fast asleep. Meanwhile, Birdie couldn't stop thinking about how to help Miss Tortoise. She is my very best friend, he said to himself. I have to find a solution. Suddenly, he had an idea. Birdie flew up and up as high as he could. He sang to the clouds, danced with the wind, and finally flew all the way to the rainbow. At sunrise, Mrs. Tortoise woke up to a surprise. "Oh, I must have dozed off," she exclaimed. Just then, she noticed she was close to the pond where she always freshened up, and since she was feeling thirsty, she went over for a drink. She gazed at her reflection in the water. But what's happened? An astonished Mrs. Tortoise asked herself. Do you like it? Birdie asked, nervously fluttering above his friend. It's magnificent, she said, admiring her colorful appearance. The rainbow gave me some paint and, well, there you have it. Besides singing, I also love to paint, chirped Birdie. Look, Birdie painted her tortoise shell. It's got all the colors. He's got his palette and his brush. Oh, it's so pretty, said the grateful Mrs. Tortoise. Yesterday I was so mean to you. I hope you can forgive me. You know you are my very best friend, right? You are my best friend too, replied Birdie excitedly. She's all happy in her colorful shell. She's giving Birdie a hug. Mrs. Tortoise knew that something extraordinary was going to happen to her, and she was right. The wrinkles on her face and her old shell didn't bother her anymore. Birdie was right by her side, and that was all that mattered. Look at all those pictures from all the fun times they've had together. A surprise for Mrs. Tortoise.